They spat on the saloon maid for spilling water, until the Modoc stepped in, and the room went silent. Silver Ridge, Arizona Territory, 1876. A dusty frontier town where the sun baked mercy out of men and left only thirst. The Copper Star Saloon stood at the edge of Main Street, its wooden frame warped by heat and time, its windows fogged with smoke and secrets. It was the kind of place where fortunes were lost over card tables and reputations were drowned in whiskey, where women like Hannah Price worked not because they wanted to, but because survival left no other door open. Hannah was 22 years old, though the work had aged her beyond her years. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, wisps escaping to frame a face that might have been called pretty if anyone had bothered to look past the stained apron and calloused hands. Her grey eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had learned early that the world was neither kind nor fair, and that complaining about it only made things worse. She had been working at the Copper Star for 3 years, ever since her father died in a mining accident and left her with nothing but debt and a name that meant less than dirt in a town that only respected gold. The saloon owner, a bloated snake of a man named Vernon Haskell, had offered her work with a smile that never reached his eyes, and she had taken it because the alternative was starvation or worse. The day it happened was a Saturday, the busiest day of the week. Miners and ranchers and drifters packed the saloon from noon until midnight, their voices rising in competition with the off-key piano that wheezed in the corner. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of sweat and spilled beer, and Hannah moved through it all like a ghost, invisible until someone needed something. She carried a tray of drinks balanced on one hand, navigating between bodies that paid her no mind except to occasionally grab at her skirt or mutter something crude that she pretended not to hear. She had learned to move quickly, to keep her eyes down, to smile when expected and disappear when not. It was a dance she had perfected out of necessity, a survival skill as essential as breathing. At the center table sat the men who mattered, or at least who thought they did. There was Cornelius Blackwood, the mine owner, a man whose wealth was built on the broken backs of men like Hannah's father. Beside him sat Mayor Thornton, whose political power extended exactly as far as Blackwood's money allowed, and scattered around them were ranchers, land speculators, and the kind of men who wore their cruelty like a badge of honor. Hannah approached their table with a pitcher of water, something Blackwood had demanded with a snap of his fingers. The whiskey had made him meaner than usual, and his face was flushed red beneath his expensive hat. She moved carefully, aware that these men were powder kegs, that one wrong move could ignite something she couldn't control. She poured the first glass without incident, then the second, but as she reached for the third, someone at the next table stumbled backward. Drunk and laughing, his elbow colliding with her arm, the pitcher tilted and water splashed across the table, soaking the papers Blackwood had spread out. Contracts or maps or something he clearly valued more than human decency. The saloon didn't go quiet immediately, but the silence spread like spilled ink. Conversation died in ripples as people turned to watch, because everyone knew what came next. Everyone knew that men like Blackwood didn't forgive accidents, especially not from women like Hannah. Blackwood stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound like a death rattle. His face had gone from red to purple, a vein throbbing at his temple. He stared at the ruined papers, then at Hannah, and when he spoke, his voice was cold enough to freeze blood. "You stupid, clumsy wretch," he said, each word measured and sharp. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? These contracts are worth more than you'll earn in 10 lifetimes. More than your worthless hide is worth." Hannah's hands shook, the empty pitcher nearly slipping from her grip. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain about the drunk man. But the words caught in her throat because she knew it wouldn't matter. Nothing she said would matter. "I'm sorry, sir," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "It was an accident. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean," Blackwood mocked, his voice rising now, carrying to every corner of the saloon. "You never mean anything, do you? You're just a worthless piece of trash, taking up space in my town. Your father was worthless too, died like a dog in that mine. And you're no better." The insult to her father hit harder than any physical blow could have. Hannah's vision blurred, not with tears but with something hotter, angrier. But she swallowed it down because anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. Mayor Thornton laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Maybe she needs to learn some respect, Blackwood. Maybe someone needs to teach her that actions have consequences." One of the ranchers, a man named Dutch Carroll with a reputation for violence, stood up and walked toward Hannah, his boots heavy on the floor. He grabbed the pitcher from her hands and examined it with theatrical disgust. "Looks like this needs refilling," he said, then turned it upside down, shaking out the last few drops onto her head. The water was cold, shocking. It ran down her face and soaked into her dress, and the laughter that followed was worse than the water. It came from everywhere, from men she had served 100 times, from people who had smiled at her just moments before, cruel laughter that stripped away the last shred of dignity she had been clinging to. "Maybe that'll wash some sense into her," Dutch said, grinning. Hannah stood frozen, water dripping from her hair, her dress clinging to her skin. She wanted to run, to disappear, but her legs wouldn't move. Her body had betrayed her just like everything else. Then Blackwood did something worse. He leaned forward, his face inches from hers, and he spat. The saliva hit her cheek, warm and degrading, and the laughter stopped for just a moment, replaced by shocked gasps, and then even louder, more vicious amusement. "That's what I think of you and your apologies," Blackwood said. Hannah's hand moved instinctively to wipe her face, but before she could, someone else spat at her. One of the younger ranchers, emboldened by Blackwood's example, then another, and suddenly it became a game, a demonstration of power and contempt. Men who would never have dared such cruelty alone found courage in the crowd. She stumbled backward, her back hitting the bar, trapped. Vernon Haskell stood behind the counter, watching with the detached interest of someone observing an insect being pulled apart by children. He made no move to help her. To stop them, she was expendable, replaceable, worth less to him than the bottles on his shelves. Hannah's mind screamed at her to move, to fight, to do something. But her body remained paralyzed by humiliation, so complete it felt like drowning. The faces around her blurred into a mass of cruelty. Each laugh a knife, each sneer a reminder that she was alone, that no one would stand for her, that this was what her life had become. And then the door opened. It wasn't a loud entrance, no dramatic slam of wood against frame, just the quiet creak of hinges and the subtle shift of light as someone stepped inside. But the change in the room was immediate, instinctive, like animals sensing a predator. The laughter faltered, then died completely. Hannah couldn't see who had entered. Her vision still blurred, her mind still reeling. But she felt the shift in the air, felt the attention of the room pivot away from her toward whoever stood in the doorway. The man who stepped into the Copper Star was unlike anyone else in that saloon. He was Modoc, his skin burnished copper by sun and heritage, his black hair long and bound with a strip of leather. He wore traditional clothing mixed with practical frontier gear, deerskin shirt, dark trousers, boots worn from travel, and a belt that held a knife with a bone handle. His name was Nakato, though few in Silver Ridge knew it, and fewer still would have dared to use it without permission. He was known in whispers, in stories told around campfires, a man who had fought in the Modoc Wars, who had survived when so many of his people had not, who now moved through the white man's world like smoke, present but untouchable. He was not tall by white standards, but he carried himself with a presence that made height irrelevant. His face was sharp-featured, weathered, with eyes that missed nothing, eyes that had seen too much death and too much injustice to be impressed by the posturing of small men in smaller towns. Nakato's gaze swept the saloon, taking in the scene in an instant, the wet, trembling woman at the bar, the men still grinning with their casual cruelty, the owner watching with calculated indifference. He had seen this before, in 100 different forms, the strong devouring the weak because they could, because no one would stop them. He walked forward, his steps measured and deliberate. The crowd parted without conscious thought, instinct moving them aside. Men who had been laughing moments before now found reasons to look elsewhere, to study their drinks, to remember urgent business elsewhere in the room. Nakato stopped in front of Blackwood, close enough that the mine owner had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, and in that silence, power shifted. "You spit on women," Nakato said, his voice quiet but carrying. English spoken with the precise care of someone for whom it was a learned language. "This makes you feel strong." It wasn't a question, it was an observation, and the contempt in his tone was unmistakable. Blackwood's face flushed again, but this time with something other than anger, something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "This is none of your concern, Indian," he said, trying to inject authority into his voice and failing. "This is between me and my employee. She is not your property," Nakato said, "and this saloon is a public place. What happens here concerns anyone who sees it." Dutch Carroll, emboldened by whiskey and stupidity, stepped forward, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip. "You'd best move along." "Chief," he said, the slur deliberate, "before you find yourself in trouble you can't handle." Nakato's eyes shifted to Dutch, and whatever the rancher saw there made him go pale. The hand that had been reaching for his gun froze, then slowly moved away. Nakato hadn't moved, hadn't threatened, but the promise of violence hung in the air like summer lightning. "I have handled trouble you cannot imagine," Nakato said softly. "I have buried friends and enemies both. I have fought wars that this town will never know. And I have learned that true weakness is not in those who fall, but in those who kick them when they are down." He turned back to Blackwood. "You are weak," he said simply, "all of you. You gather like wolves because alone you are nothing. You spit on a woman because she cannot fight back, because you need someone beneath you to feel tall, but you are not tall. You are small, and everyone in this room knows it." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Blackwood opened his mouth, then closed it, for once in his life. He had nothing to say. Nakato moved past him, walking to where Hannah still stood against the bar, her face wet with water and spit and tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a cloth, clean and carefully folded, and offered it to her. Hannah stared at it, then at him, unable to process what was happening. Her mind couldn't reconcile the kindness of the gesture with the cruelty she had just endured. Couldn't understand why this stranger, this man her people had fought and displaced, would show her more dignity than anyone in her own community. "Take it," Nakato said gently, in a language she didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. She took the cloth with shaking hands and pressed it to her face, wiping away the degradation, and as she did, something inside her shifted. Some locked door she hadn't known existed cracked open. Nakato turned back to the room one last time, his voice carrying to every corner. "I have traveled far," he said, "through towns and territories, and everywhere I see the same thing. People who believe cruelty makes them strong, who mistake power for worth. But I tell you this, true strength is not in how you treat those above you. It is in how you treat those below, and by that measure, everyone in this room has failed." He looked at Blackwood directly. "She is worth more than all of you," he said, "because she works with dignity in a place without it, because she survives without becoming what you are, and if you cannot see that, then you are blind as well as weak." No one spoke, no one moved. The saloon had become a church, reverent and silent, and in that silence, Hannah felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Something she had almost forgotten existed. She felt seen. Nakato nodded once to her, a gesture of respect between equals, then turned and walked back toward the door. The crowd parted again, wider this time. Men who had been laughing now couldn't meet his eyes. And as he reached the threshold, he paused and looked back one final time. "If I hear of this woman being harmed," he said, "I will return, and I will not be so kind." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than any slam could have. For a long moment no one moved, the spell of his presence still holding them frozen. Then slowly, awkwardly, the saloon began to breathe again. Men turned back to their drinks. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Blackwood sat down heavily, his papers forgotten, his face still pale. Hannah stood at the bar, the cloth clutched in her hands, her mind racing. She didn't understand what had just happened, didn't understand why, but she knew with absolute certainty that her life had just changed, that the door Nakato had opened inside her would never fully close again. Vernon Haskell cleared his throat. "Get back to work," he said. But his voice lacked its usual authority, and Hannah, for the first time since she had started working there, didn't immediately obey. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what Nakato had seen, a small man pretending to be large, and she realized that she didn't have to accept that pretense anymore. Not completely, not without question. "I need a moment," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. Haskell opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it and nodded. Something had shifted, not just in Hannah, but in the room itself, and he was smart enough to recognize that some changes couldn't be undone. Hannah walked to the back room, her legs finally steady, and sat down on an old crate. She pressed the cloth to her face again, breathing in the scent of sage and smoke, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to cry, not from humiliation or pain, but from the overwhelming realization that someone had stood for her, that someone had seen her worth when she had almost forgotten it existed. Outside, the sun continued its journey across the Arizona sky, indifferent to the dramas of small towns and smaller people. But inside the Copper Star Saloon, something had begun, something that would grow in ways no one could predict. A seed planted in silence, watered by dignity, and tended by 2 people who had no reason to care about each other, except that they both understood what it meant to be cast aside. Hannah dried her tears, folded the cloth carefully and stood up. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if she would ever see the Modoc man again. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was done being invisible, done accepting cruelty as the price of survival. Nakato had shown her that there was another way. The dignity didn't have to be earned from those who would never grant it, that it could simply be claimed. She walked back into the saloon, her head higher than before, and got back to work. But everything was different now. The men at the table seemed smaller somehow, their laughter less certain, their cruelty less absolute. And Hannah moved through the room not as a ghost, but as a woman who had remembered she was human. 3 days passed before Hannah saw Nakato again. 3 days during which the Copper Star Saloon felt different. The men still drank and gambled and cursed, but there was a new restraint in how they spoke to her, a hesitance that hadn't existed before. Blackwood hadn't returned since that Saturday, and Dutch Carroll kept his distance, his eyes sliding away whenever she passed his table. Vernon Haskell watched her with something between suspicion and calculation, as if trying to determine whether she had somehow orchestrated what happened, whether she possessed some power he hadn't recognized. The truth was simpler and more complex than he could imagine. Hannah had simply stopped shrinking herself to fit into their expectations. She moved through her work with the same efficiency as always, but her shoulders no longer curved inward defensively. Her eyes no longer fixed themselves permanently on the floor. She met customers' gazes directly, responded to their orders without the apologetic tone that had once colored every word. And when a drunk miner reached for her skirt on Tuesday evening, she stepped back and said clearly, "Don't touch me," and he had actually listened. The cloth Nakato had given her remained folded in her apron pocket. She touched it sometimes when the old fears crept back, when the memory of humiliation threatened to pull her down into the darkness she had lived in for so long. The fabric was soft against her fingers, worn from use but clean, and it carried the faint scent of sage smoke that reminded her someone had seen her as human. On the 4th day, Hannah finished her shift just after sunset and stepped out the back door of the saloon into the alley where she always paused to breathe air that hadn't been poisoned by tobacco and whiskey. The sky was deepening from orange to purple, and the desert wind carried the coolness that only came after the sun released its grip on the land. Nakato was standing at the far end of the alley, his back against the weathered wall of the general store. He wasn't hiding exactly, but he had positioned himself where he could see without being immediately seen. When Hannah emerged, he straightened, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across 20 feet of dusty ground. Hannah's heart jumped, not from fear, but from something she couldn't name. She had wondered if she would see him again, had alternated between hoping and dreading it, because his kindness had opened something in her that she didn't know how to close. And kindness from strangers always came with expectations she couldn't predict. Nakato made no move toward her, just raised one hand in a gesture of greeting. He seemed to be waiting for permission, for some sign that she wanted to speak, and that patience, that respect for her choice, decided her. She walked toward him, her steps deliberate but not hurried. As she got closer, she could see his face more clearly in the fading light, the lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and grief in equal measure, the scar that ran along his jaw like a white thread against copper skin, the quiet strength that radiated from him, not as aggression but as certainty. "You came back," she said when she was close enough that speaking wouldn't carry to the street. "I wanted to see if you were well," Nakato replied. His English careful but not hesitant. "The men in that place, they do not easily forget being shamed. They've left me alone," Hannah said, then added with a small, bitter smile. "Mostly." Nakato nodded, as if this confirmed something he had expected. "Fear is a poor teacher," he said, "but sometimes it is the only one people understand." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the town filtering around them. Somewhere a dog barked, a baby cried. The piano in the copper star wheezed through another tuneless melody. Normal sounds of normal life, except nothing felt normal anymore. "Why did you help me?" Hannah asked suddenly. The question that had been circling in her mind for 4 days, finally breaking free. "You don't know me. You have no reason to care what happens to some saloon girl in a town that probably treats your people worse than they treat me." Nakato considered the question, his eyes moving to the darkening sky as if the answer might be written there. "When I was young," he said finally, "maybe 14 summers, I watched white soldiers burn our village. They did it because they could, because we were in the way of land they wanted. My mother was caught in one of the lodges." He paused, and Hannah saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. "I tried to help her," he continued, "but a soldier hit me with his rifle, knocked me down. And when I tried to stand, he spat on me just like that man spat on you. And he laughed while my mother burned." Hannah's breath caught, her hand instinctively reaching toward him, then stopping, unsure if touch would be welcome. "No one helped us that day," Nakato said, his voice still steady, but carrying an old pain that would never fully heal. "No one stood between us and cruelty, and I promised myself if I survived, if I lived through that day and all the days of war that followed, I would not walk past suffering when I had the power to stop it. I would not be like those who watched and did nothing. I'm sorry," Hannah whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. Nakato shook his head. "You do not apologize for their actions," he said. "You did not burn my village, you did not kill my mother, but you live in a world that allows such things, just as I do, and we must each decide what kind of person we will be in such a world." Hannah looked down at her hands, calloused and red from years of hard work, hands that had scrubbed floors and carried trays and been too weak to defend her when it mattered. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I am," she said quietly. "I don't know how to be strong like you." "Strength is not what you think it is," Nakato said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone. "You have worked in that place for how long?" 3 years, Hannah answered. 3 years, Nakato repeated. 3 years of insults and cruelty, of men who see you as less than human, And yet you continue, you survive. You do not become cruel yourself. That is strength. Perhaps the truest kind. Hannah felt tears prickling at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being understood. It doesn't feel like strength, she admitted. It feels like just not dying. Sometimes that is the same thing, Nakato said. They fell into silence again, but it was a different quality of silence now. Not awkward or uncertain, but companionable, as if they had known each other longer than 4 days, as if their shared understanding of suffering had created a bridge that others might take years to build. I brought you something, Nakato said after a while. Reaching into the leather bag that hung at his side, he pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth and offered it to her. Hannah took it carefully, surprised by its weight. She unwrapped the cloth to find a book, old and worn, the leather cover soft from years of handling. She opened it to find pages filled with careful handwriting in English. Alongside drawings of plants and landscapes, it belonged to a teacher, Nakato explained. A white woman who came to our territory before the wars. She taught some of our children to read and write. She drew pictures of the plants we used for medicine, for food. She tried to build a bridge between our peoples. What happened to her? Hannah asked, though she feared she knew the answer. She died when the soldiers came, Nakato said simply. They did not care that she was trying to help. They only saw someone who sided with Indians. But before she died, she gave this to my sister, told her that knowledge was the only thing no one could take from us. Hannah looked at the book with new reverence, understanding the weight of what he was offering. I can't take this, she said, trying to hand it back. It's too valuable. It belongs to your family. Nakato gently pushed her hands back. My sister died in the wars too, he said. All my family is gone. This book should go to someone who will value it, who understands what it means to fight for dignity in a world that denies it. That is you. Hannah clutched the book to her chest, emotion overwhelming her. I don't know how to thank you, she managed. You do not need to thank me, Nakato said. But if you want to honor this gift, then read it, learn from it. Understand that strength comes in many forms, and that knowledge is power that no one can spit away. The door of the Copper Star banged open, and Vernon Haskell's voice carried into the alley. Hannah, where the hell did you go? We've got customers. Hannah turned toward the voice, then back to Nakato, but he had already stepped back into the shadows, his form blending with the darkness in a way that seemed almost supernatural. Before she could speak, he was gone, as if he had never been there at all. She tucked the book carefully into her bag, making sure it was completely hidden, then walked back into the saloon. But everything had changed again. She had changed. The book felt like a talisman against her side, a reminder that she was more than this place, more than what these men thought of her. The next morning, Hannah woke before dawn in the small room she rented above the dry goods store. It was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wooden crate that served as both chair and table. But it was hers, paid for with money she earned, and no one could take it from her without her consent. She lit the oil lamp and carefully opened the book Nakato had given her. The first page had an inscription in elegant handwriting. To those who seek to understand, knowledge is the bridge between peoples. Ignorance is the wall. Choose bridges. Sarah Mitchell. 868. Hannah traced the words with her finger, imagining the woman who had written them, who had gone to live among the Modoc and tried to build those bridges, who had died for that choice. There was courage in those words. The kind of courage Hannah wasn't sure she possessed, but wanted desperately to find. She turned the pages slowly, studying the drawings of plants. Some she recognized from the desert around Silver Ridge. Others were unfamiliar. Beside each drawing was a description of its uses. This one for fever, this one for wounds, this one for the pains women endured monthly. Sarah Mitchell had documented an entire pharmacopoeia of native knowledge, a gift that could have benefited everyone if anyone had been willing to receive it. Hannah read until the sun crept through her single window, until the sounds of the town waking forced her to prepare for another day at the Copper Star. But she felt different, as if the book had filled some empty space inside her that she hadn't known existed. It wasn't just the knowledge itself, but the reminder that learning was possible, that change was possible, that she didn't have to remain exactly as she was. That afternoon, during the brief lull between the lunch crowd and the evening rush, Hannah found herself serving Marcus Webb, the town's only doctor. He was a tired-looking man in his 50s. Competent enough when sober, but too fond of his own remedies, he sat alone at a corner table, nursing coffee and staring at nothing. Hannah refilled his cup without being asked, then hesitated. The book had mentioned a plant called yarrow, useful for stopping bleeding, and she had noticed some growing behind the boarding house just that morning. Before she could talk herself out of it, she spoke. "Dr. Webb," she said, keeping her voice low, "do you know anything about yarrow?" "The plant?" He looked up, surprised that she had addressed him with anything other than the minimum required for service. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Yarrow, he repeated, considering, yes, it's a common herb, grows wild around here. Some of the old-timers use it for wounds, helps clot blood. Is it effective? Hannah pressed. Webb shrugged. More effective than nothing, he said. Probably about as good as some of the expensive powders I order from back east. But people don't trust medicine that grows free. They want to pay for cures. Makes them feel like they're getting something valuable. Hannah nodded, filing this information away. Thank you, she said. Webb studied her with new interest. Why do you ask? He said. You planning on becoming a healer? Just curious, Hannah replied. But something in her tone must have conveyed more, because Webb's expression softened. Curiosity is how learning starts, he said. Most people in this town stopped being curious years ago if they ever started. Don't lose that. Miss Price? It was the first time anyone in Silver Ridge had called her Miss Price, instead of just Hannah or girl or something worse. The simple courtesy hit her harder than she expected. She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and moved away before emotion could overwhelm her. That evening, after her shift, Hannah walked to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open desert. She had asked the general store owner if he had any empty bottles, claiming she wanted them for storing preserves, and he had given her 3 without charge, grateful, perhaps, that someone was asking for something so simple. She walked until she found the yarrow growing in scraggly clusters among the rocks. Using the descriptions and drawings from Sarah Mitchell's book to confirm the identification, she carefully harvested several plants, roots and all, and placed them in her bag. Tomorrow, she would try to prepare them the way the book described, drying the leaves and flowers, pounding the roots into powder. As she worked, she became aware of a presence nearby. She looked up to find Nakato sitting on a boulder about 30 yards away. Watching her with what might have been approval, he didn't approach, didn't speak, just acknowledged her with a slight nod before disappearing again into the twilight. Hannah smiled, understanding that he was keeping watch, making sure she was safe, but also giving her space to discover things on her own. It was a different kind of protection than she had ever known. Not suffocating or possessive, but respectful, trusting her competence while remaining ready to help if needed. Over the following week, a pattern emerged. Hannah would work her shifts at the Copper Star, enduring the diminished but still present contempt of men who resented her newfound dignity. Then she would return to her room and study Sarah Mitchell's book, learning about plants and their properties, about the Modoc way of understanding the land, about a world far larger than the one she had been living in. And several times, when she ventured out to gather plants or simply to walk and think, she would catch glimpses of Nakato, never intruding, never demanding her attention but present, a steady reminder that she was not alone, that someone believed she was worth protecting. On the 8th day, after their first real conversation, Hannah was walking back from the creek where she had been washing her spare dress when 3 men stepped out from behind the livery stable. She recognized them immediately, Dutch Carroll and 2 of his ranch hands. all three reeking of whiskey and bad intentions. "Well, look who's gotten too good for honest folks," Dutch said, his words slurring slightly, walking around like she owns the place. Acting like she's better than us. Hannah's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm just going home," she said. "Let me pass, one of the ranch hands mocked in a high-pitched voice. "You hear that, Dutch? The little queen is giving orders now." Dutch stepped closer, and Hannah could see the anger in his eyes. The resentment of a man who had been made to look small and couldn't forgive it. "You think having some Indian defend you makes you special," he said. "You think it changes what you are. You're still just a whore working in a saloon. And it's time someone reminded you." He reached for her, his hand aiming for her arm. But before he could make contact, Nakato was there, materializing from the shadows with a speed that seemed impossible. His hand caught Dutch's wrist in mid-reach, and the rancher cried out in pain as bone ground against bone. "She asked you to let her pass," Nakato said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that promised violence if necessary. Dutch tried to pull away, but Nakato's grip was iron. The two ranch hands started forward, then stopped when Nakato's other hand moved to the knife at his belt, not drawing it, just resting on the handle. The threat was clear, explicit, undeniable. "You can't be everywhere," Dutch hissed through gritted teeth. "You can't protect her all the time." "I do not need to be everywhere," Nakato replied. "I only need to be here now, and you need to decide if your pride is worth your life." He released Dutch's wrist, and the rancher stumbled back. Cradling his arm for a moment, the possibility of violence hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Then Dutch spat on the ground and turned away, his men following, muttering threats that sounded hollow even to themselves. Nakato watched until they disappeared, then turned to Hannah. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said, but her hands were shaking. "Thank you again. I seem to only be able to say thank you to you." "Thanks are not necessary," Nakato said. Then after a pause, "But Dutch is right about one thing. I cannot be everywhere. You need to learn to protect yourself." Hannah looked at him, confused. "How?" she asked. "I'm not strong like you. I can't fight them." "There are many kinds of strength," Nakato said, "and many ways to fight. Come, if you are willing, I will teach you." He gestured toward the desert, and after only a moment's hesitation, Hannah followed. They walked in silence until the town was just a cluster of lights behind them, until the only sounds were the wind and their footsteps and the distant call of a coyote. Nakato stopped in a small clearing surrounded by rocks. "First lesson," he said, "is not about fighting, it is about awareness. Most people walk through the world half asleep. They do not see danger until it is too late. You must learn to see, to listen, to sense." He spent the next hour teaching her how to move quietly, how to position herself to always have an escape route, how to read body language and recognize when someone's intentions turned from words to action. It wasn't about making her a warrior, but about giving her tools to survive. "Second lesson," he said as the moon rose higher, "is about voice. You have learned to make yourself small, to speak softly, to apologize for existing. This makes you pray. You must learn to use your voice as a weapon." He had her practice saying no, loudly, firmly, without apology. At first her voice came out thin and uncertain, but gradually, with his patient encouragement, it grew stronger until the word echoed across the desert like a declaration of war. "Good," Nakato said, and there was genuine pride in his voice. "That sound is the sound of a woman who will not be a victim. Remember it, practice it, make it as natural as breathing." By the time they walked back toward town, Hannah felt different again, not suddenly powerful or invincible, but more solid somehow, more present in her own body, more aware of her right to occupy space in the world. As they reached the edge of Silver Ridge, Nakato stopped. "Tomorrow I will teach you about plants that can help you," he said. "Not just for healing, but for protection. There are things that grow here that can make a man very sick if used correctly. Knowledge you should have." Hannah nodded. Understanding the implication, he wasn't just teaching her to avoid danger, but to respond to it if necessary, to have options beyond submission or flight. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, needing to understand. "Why do you care?" Nakato was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "Because no one taught my sister," he said finally. "Because she died without the knowledge that might have saved her, because I cannot bring her back. But I can honor her memory by making sure other women do not die the same way." Hannah felt tears on her cheeks. But they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of recognition, of finally being seen not as an object or a problem, but as a human being worthy of investment, worthy of care. "I won't waste what you're teaching me," she promised. "I know," Nakato said, and then he was gone again, melting into the darkness like smoke. Hannah walked back to her room, her mind full of everything she had learned, everything she still had to learn. The book waited on her crate table, and she opened it again, reading by lamplight until exhaustion claimed her. But before she slept, she practiced one more time, her voice cutting through the darkness of her small room, clear and strong and unafraid. No. 2 weeks after Nakato began teaching her, Hannah discovered that knowledge could be as dangerous as ignorance, and sometimes more so. She had been studying Sarah Mitchell's book with increasing fascination, particularly the sections on plants that could heal or harm depending on dosage and preparation. And she had begun to see the desert around Silver Ridge not as empty wasteland, but as a pharmacy, waiting to be read by those who knew the language. It started innocuously enough. Old Mrs. Carmichael, who ran the boarding house, had developed a terrible cough that kept her and everyone within 3 rooms awake at night. The doctor had given her a tonic that cost 2 weeks' rent and did nothing. When Hannah overheard her complaining at the general store, she hesitated only a moment before speaking. "Mrs. Carmichael," she said quietly, "I might know something that could help." The older woman looked at her with surprise and skepticism in equal measure. "You're not a doctor, girl," she said, but there was a question in her tone rather than dismissal. "No, ma'am," Hannah agreed, "but I've been studying plants, traditional medicines. There's an herb called horehound that grows near the creek. It's very effective for coughs." Mrs. Carmichael studied her for a long moment, then shrugged with the resignation of someone who had already tried everything else. "I suppose it can't make things worse," she said. Hannah spent that afternoon gathering horehound, carefully following the book's instructions for preparation. She boiled the leaves to make a strong tea, strained it, added a bit of honey to cut the bitterness, and brought it to Mrs. Carmichael that evening. "Drink a cup 3 times a day," she instructed. "It tastes terrible, but it should help." The boarding house owner took the jar with more gratitude than Hannah had expected. "Thank you, dear," she said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. "It's kind of you to try." 3 days later, Mrs. Carmichael's cough had diminished significantly, and word began to spread in the quiet way that news traveled among women who were rarely listened to by the town's men. The seamstress came to Hannah with questions about a salve for her arthritic hands. The blacksmith's wife asked about something for her daughter's monthly pains. Slowly, carefully, Hannah began to help them. She never charged money, knowing that would invite scrutiny and possibly accusations of practicing medicine without authority. Instead, she accepted small trades, a loaf of bread, a mended dress, a bar of good soap, things that made her life slightly easier without drawing attention, and always she studied the book, cross-referencing what she tried with what Sarah Mitchell had documented, learning not just what worked, but why. Nakato watched this development with what appeared to be approval. He had continued their evening lessons, teaching her not just about plants, but about observation, about reading the land and the people who moved through it. He taught her to track animals by their prints, to predict weather by the behavior of birds, to understand the desert as a living thing rather than a backdrop. "Knowledge is good," he told her one evening as they sat on a ridge overlooking the town. "But wisdom is knowing when to share it and when to keep silent. The white man's world does not always reward women who know too much." Hannah understood his warning. She had already begun to notice the way some of the men looked at her with increased suspicion, as if her competence was somehow threatening. as if a woman who could think and learn was more dangerous than one who simply served and obeyed. But it was impossible to unknow what she had learned, impossible to ignore suffering when she had the ability to ease it. And so she continued quietly, carefully, walking a line between helping and drawing too much attention. The situation came to a head on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when a young boy ran into the Copper Star Saloon screaming for help. His father had been injured at the mine, a cave-in. He was bleeding badly, and Dr. Webb was 3 hours away in the next county delivering a baby. Vernon Haskell looked around the saloon with growing panic. There were a dozen men present, but none with any medical knowledge, none willing to take responsibility for another man's life. Then his eyes landed on Hannah. "You," he said. "I've heard you've been playing doctor with plants and such. Come with me." It wasn't a request, and Hannah felt fear grip her chest like a vice. Treating a cough or making a salve for sore hands was one thing, but a serious injury that was beyond her knowledge, beyond what the book could teach her. "I'm not a doctor," she protested. "I don't know enough." "You know more than anyone else here," Haskell snapped. "Now move." Hannah grabbed her bag, the one where she kept her gathered herbs and the book, and ran with Haskell and several other men toward the mine. Her mind raced through everything she had learned, trying to remember anything about serious wounds, about blood loss, about what to do when someone might die. The injured man was named Thomas Brennan, a miner in his 30s with a wife and 3 children. He was lying on the ground outside the mine entrance, his leg crushed beneath a fallen timber, blood soaking into the dust beneath him. His face was grey with shock and pain, and the men standing around him looked helpless and terrified. Hannah dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking. She could see the wound was bad, very bad. The timber had been lifted off, but the damage was severe. Bone might be broken. Certainly blood vessels were torn. He was bleeding faster than his body could afford to lose. "Someone get me clean water," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice, "and cloth as much as you can find. Boil the water first if there's time." The men scattered to obey, grateful for any direction, any sense that someone knew what to do. Hannah opened her bag and pulled out the yarrow powder she had prepared. The book said it helped clotting, would help stop bleeding, but she had never used it for something this serious. She packed the wound with yarrow. Pressing hard to create pressure, Brennan screamed, a sound that would haunt her dreams for weeks. But the bleeding began to slow when the hot water arrived. She cleaned around the wound as best she could, trying to remember everything Sarah Mitchell had written about preventing infection. "We need to get him to a real doctor," she said to Haskell. "I've stopped the worst of the bleeding, but he needs more help than I can give." "The doc won't be back until tomorrow," Haskell said grimly. "Can you keep him alive until then?" Hannah wanted to say no, wanted to run from this responsibility. But Brennan's wife had just arrived, her face white with terror, and 3 small children clung to her skirts, staring at their father with eyes too young to understand death, but old enough to fear it. "I'll try," Hannah said, because there was no other answer she could give. She stayed with Thomas Brennan through the night, changing the dressings on his wound, making sure he drank water to replace what he had lost, using willow bark tea to manage his pain and fever. The book said willow bark worked like the expensive aspirin powder doctors used, and she prayed it was strong enough. Nakato appeared sometime after midnight, materializing from the darkness without explanation. He sat beside her, not speaking, just present. When her hands shook too badly to tie a bandage, he steadied them with his own when exhaustion made her eyes blur. He brought her coffee that someone had made, bitter and strong. "You are doing well," he said quietly. "Better than many trained doctors I have seen." "He might die," Hannah whispered, voicing her deepest fear. "If he dies, it will be my fault. If he dies, it will be because of bad luck and a falling timber," Nakato corrected gently. "Not because of you. You are giving him a chance he would not have otherwise. That is all anyone can do." When dawn broke pink and gold over the desert, Thomas Brennan was still alive. His breathing had steadied, his fever had dropped. And when Dr. Webb finally arrived, dusty and exhausted from his night ride, he examined Hannah's work with increasing surprise. "Who did this?" he demanded, not accusatory but genuinely curious. "I did," Hannah said, too tired to be anything but honest. Webb looked at her with new respect. "You probably saved his life," he said. "The yarrow was smart. The willow bark, too." "Where did you learn this?" Hannah hesitated, then pulled out Sarah Mitchell's book and showed it to him. Webb handled it reverently, turning pages and reading passages. "This is remarkable," he said. "I've heard of this woman. She lived with the Modoc for several years, documented their medical practices. I thought all her work was lost." "It should be shared," Hannah said impulsively. "Other people should know this." Webb nodded slowly. "Perhaps," he said, "but be careful, Miss Price. There are people in this town who don't like the idea of Indians knowing things white folks don't, and they like even less the idea of white women learning from them." His warning proved prophetic. By noon, word had spread through Silver Ridge that Hannah had treated Thomas Brennan using Indian medicine, and that the book she had learned from came from a woman who had lived among the Modoc. The reactions were mixed. Some people were grateful and impressed. Others were suspicious and resentful. Cornelius Blackwood was firmly in the latter camp. When he returned to the Copper Star that evening, he did so with purpose and a group of like-minded men. Hannah was working her shift, exhausted from the previous night, but unable to afford missing work. When she saw Blackwood enter, her stomach clenched with familiar dread. "I hear you've been practicing medicine," Blackwood announced loudly, ensuring everyone could hear, "using savage remedies, filling people's heads with dangerous ideas." Hannah set down the tray she was carrying and turned to face him, remembering Nakato's lessons about voice, about refusing to make herself small. "I helped a man who was dying," she said clearly, "using knowledge that worked. Thomas Brennan is alive because of what I did. Thomas Brennan is alive because of luck." Blackwood sneered. "And you're a fool playing with things you don't understand. Indian medicine, as if those people know anything worth knowing. They know plenty," Hannah said, her voice growing stronger. "They've survived in this land for thousands of years. They understand plants and healing in ways we've forgotten or never learned." Sarah Mitchell recognized that. She respected their knowledge. "Sarah Mitchell was a traitor," Blackwood spat. "She sided with savages over her own people, and she died for it. Is that what you want? To end up dead in some ditch because you think Indians are worth learning from?" The saloon had gone quiet, everyone watching to see how this confrontation would resolve. Hannah felt her heart pounding, felt the old fear trying to reclaim her, but she thought of Nakato's sister, who had died without the knowledge that might have saved her. Thought of Thomas Brennan's children who still had a father because she had tried. "I want to help people," she said. "I want to learn and grow and be useful. If that makes me a traitor in your eyes, then I suppose I'm a traitor." Blackwood's face purpled with rage. He stepped forward, his hand raised as if to strike her, and Hannah braced herself, but the blow never came. Mayor Thornton, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, stood up and cleared his throat. "Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying unexpected authority. "That's enough." The mine owner turned on him. "You're defending her," he said incredulously. "After everything—" "I'm defending common sense," Thornton interrupted. "My wife's arthritis has improved significantly since Miss Price gave her that salve. Mrs. Carmichael is sleeping through the night for the first time in months, and Thomas Brennan is alive. These are facts, and facts don't care about our prejudices." He looked around the saloon, meeting the eyes of other men. "Half the women in this town have been helped by Miss Price's remedies," he continued, "quietly, without fanfare, without charging the outrageous prices Dr. Webb commands. Now maybe some of you don't like where she learned these things. Maybe you don't like that an Indian gave her that book. But I suggest you think carefully about whether your pride is more important than your family's health." A murmur ran through the crowd, not entirely supportive, but not hostile either, uncertain. which was better than Hannah had dared hope. Blackwood looked around and seemed to realize he had miscalculated, that whatever support he expected had not materialized. "This isn't over," he said darkly, then stormed out of the saloon, taking his closest allies with him. Hannah's legs nearly gave out with relief. Vernon Haskell appeared beside her with a glass of water. "Drink this," he said gruffly, "and then get back to work. The customers are getting thirsty." It was the closest thing to approval she would get from him, and she took it gratefully. That night, when she finally escaped the Copper Star, she found Nakato waiting in their usual spot at the end of the alley. "I heard what happened," he said. "You stood your ground." "I was terrified," Hannah admitted. "Courage is not the absence of fear," Nakato said. "It is acting despite fear. You did well." They walked into the desert, seeking the privacy that only darkness and distance could provide. Hannah felt wrung out, exhausted not just physically but emotionally. She had crossed some invisible line today, had declared herself as someone who would not be easily intimidated, and she knew there would be consequences. "Blackwood won't forget this," she said. "He'll find a way to hurt me." "Probably," Nakato agreed. "Men like him always do, but you have something now that you didn't have before." "What?" Hannah asked. "Allies," Nakato said. "People who have benefited from your help. People who will remember that you treated them with respect and skill. That is a kind of power, and Blackwood fears it." They sat on a flat rock, looking up at the stars that seemed impossibly bright and close in the desert night. Hannah felt the book in her bag, felt the weight of responsibility that came with knowledge, with the ability to help or harm. "Sarah Mitchell died trying to build bridges between peoples," she said quietly. "Was it worth it, if it ended in her death?" Nakato was silent for a long time. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "I know that she helped my people, that she gave us tools to survive in a changing world. I know that my sister carried her book as a treasure, that she believed education was the path to coexistence, whether that belief was foolish or wise. I cannot say—" "What do you believe?" Hannah asked. "I believe that knowledge should be shared," Nakato said. "I believe that healing should not belong to one people or one way. I believe that the world would be better if more people thought like Sarah Mitchell, even if such thinking is dangerous." "You're teaching me because of that belief," Hannah said, understanding. "I am teaching you because you are willing to learn," Nakato replied. "Because you see value in knowledge that others dismiss. Because you have the courage to stand against people like Blackwood and say that their prejudice does not define truth." Hannah felt tears welling up, the emotional toll of the day finally breaking through her defenses. "I don't feel courageous," she said. "I feel scared and small and like I'm in over my head." "Good," Nakato said, surprising her. "People who feel too courageous make stupid mistakes. People who know their limitations are careful, thoughtful. They survive." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I brought you something," he said. "More seeds, medicinal plants that you can grow yourself, so you do not have to rely only on what you can find in the wild." Hannah took the pouch, feeling the weight of the seeds inside. "Where will I grow them?" She asked. "I have no land." "There is land behind the boarding house," Nakato said. "Mrs. Carmichael has a garden that she cannot tend anymore. Her hands are too painful. Perhaps if you offered to maintain it in exchange for growing your herbs there." "She would agree." "You've thought this through," Hannah said. "I have watched you," Nakato replied simply. "I have seen how you think, how you plan. I know you will need more supplies as more people come to you for help. Better to be prepared." Hannah looked at the pouch of seeds, then at Nakato. This man who had defended her, taught her, equipped her for a future she hadn't even imagined possible. "Why me?" she asked again, the question that never quite found a satisfactory answer. "Of all the people you could help, why have you chosen me?" Nakato met her eyes in the starlight. "Because you reminded me of my sister," he said softly. The way you stood in that saloon after they humiliated you, the way you did not let shame destroy you. She would have liked you, I think, would have recognized a kindred spirit. I wish I could have known her, Hannah said. You know her through her book, Nakato replied, through the knowledge she valued enough to preserve, through the bridge she tried to build. In a way, by learning from that book, by using that knowledge to help others, you are continuing her work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The thought settled over Hannah like a mantle. Heavy, but not unwelcome. She had spent so long thinking of herself as powerless, as someone to whom things happened, rather than someone who made things happen. But slowly, day by day, lesson by lesson, that was changing. I won't let you down, she said, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was speaking to Nakato or to the memory of his sister or to Sarah Mitchell or to herself. You have not let anyone down, Nakato said. You have only just begun. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, then walked back toward town together, but this time, when they reached the edge of Silver Ridge, Nakato didn't immediately disappear into the shadows. Instead, he walked with her all the way to the boarding house, a small gesture that felt significant, a public acknowledgement of their connection. Mrs. Carmichael was sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool evening air, when she saw them approach together. Her eyebrows rose, but she said nothing until Hannah climbed the steps. Miss Price, she said, then nodded politely to Nakato. Sir, Mrs. Carmichael, Hannah said, gathering her courage. I was wondering if I might speak with you about your garden. The older woman's eyes sharpened with interest. What about it? She asked. I've noticed it's become overgrown, Hannah said carefully. My hands aren't what they used to be. And I was thinking if you'd allow me to tend it, to plant some herbs there that I could use for medicines. I would make sure it was properly maintained, and you would have access to any of the plants for your own use. Mrs. Carmichael looked at Nakato, then back at Hannah. This is about what happened today at the mine, she said. Not a question. Yes, ma'am, Hannah admitted. People are talking, Mrs. Carmichael said. Some saying you're a healer. Others saying you're dabbling in things you shouldn't. I'm just trying to help, Hannah said simply. Mrs. Carmichael nodded slowly. My daughter died of fever 10 years ago, she said quietly. The doctor couldn't save her, said there was nothing to be done. I've wondered ever since if there was something, some plant, some remedy that we didn't know about, that might have made a difference. She stood up, her movements stiff with age and pain. You can use the garden, she said. On one condition. What's that? Hannah asked. You teach me, Mrs. Carmichael said. I'm old, but I'm not dead yet, and I'd like to learn something useful before I go. Hannah felt a smile breaking across her face, the first genuine smile in longer than she could remember. I would be honored, she said. Mrs. Carmichael nodded in satisfaction, then looked at Nakato again. You're the one who gave her that book, she said. I am, Nakato confirmed. It was a good gift, Mrs. Carmichael said. Better than most, you have my thanks. She went inside. Leaving Hannah and Nakato alone on the porch, Hannah turned to him, hardly able to believe what had just happened. I have a garden, she said, wonder in her voice. You have a purpose, Nakato corrected. And you have an ally, perhaps more than one. This is how change begins, not with grand gestures, but with small acts of courage that inspire others. He started to leave, then paused and looked back. Be careful, Hannah Price, he said. Using her name for the first time, you have made yourself visible, and that brings danger as well as opportunity. But I believe you are ready for both. Then he was gone, and Hannah stood alone on the porch, the pouch of seeds in her pocket and a future unfolding before her that she had never dared to imagine. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a vengeance that caught Silver Ridge unprepared. By mid-November, temperatures dropped so sharply that water froze in barrels overnight, and the desert wind carried ice that stung exposed skin like tiny knives. The town huddled closer together, both for warmth and because the cold made distances feel longer, made isolation more dangerous. Hannah's garden behind the boarding house had flourished during the brief autumn. The seeds Nakato provided had taken root with surprising vigor, and she had managed to harvest a decent supply of dried herbs before the first frost. Mrs. Carmichael had been true to her word, learning alongside Hannah with an enthusiasm that belied her age. And together they had created a small sanctuary of growing things that seemed almost miraculous in the harsh landscape. But the cold brought new challenges. People got sick more frequently. Children developed coughs that turned into fevers. Old injuries ached with renewed intensity. And Dr. Webb, for all his competence, couldn't be everywhere at once. Hannah found herself treating more people than ever. Her little room above the dry goods store becoming an unofficial clinic where women and children came seeking remedies that didn't cost a week's wages. She still worked at the Copper Star because Vernon Haskell paid her barely enough to survive, and she couldn't afford to lose even that meager income. But the work felt different now. She moved through the saloon with a new kind of authority. The men still drank and cursed and occasionally made crude comments. But there was a line they no longer crossed. Whether from respect or fear of Nakato's retribution, Hannah couldn't say and didn't particularly care. Nakato himself had become less visible as winter deepened. He still appeared occasionally, usually when Hannah ventured out to gather what few plants could be found in the frozen landscape. But their conversations had grown briefer, more practical. He seemed preoccupied with something he wouldn't discuss. And Hannah had learned not to push him for answers he wasn't ready to give. What she didn't know was that tensions between the white settlers and the remaining Modoc families living on the territory's edge had been escalating. There had been incidents, accusations of stolen livestock, threats exchanged, the kind of friction that in other places and other times had exploded into violence. Nakato was spending most of his time trying to mediate, trying to prevent another war that his people could not afford to fight. The crisis came on a Wednesday in early December, when a blizzard swept through Silver Ridge with fury that seemed almost personal. The snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet, and the temperature plummeted so far that exposed skin could freeze in minutes. The town essentially shut down, people stayed indoors, burning whatever fuel they had and praying the storm would pass quickly. Hannah was working an evening shift at the Copper Star when the door burst open and a man stumbled in. Covered in snow and barely able to stand, it took a moment for anyone to recognize him as Jack Porter, a rancher whose spread lay about 5 miles outside town. He collapsed against the bar, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "My wife," he gasped. "She's in labor. The baby's coming wrong. She's dying. I rode here for the doctor, but I can't find him anywhere." Vernon Haskell looked around the saloon with growing alarm. "Webb left this morning for the territorial capital," he said. "Some kind of medical conference. He won't be back for 3 days." Porter's face went white with despair. 3 days, he repeated numbly. "She doesn't have 3 days. She doesn't have 3 hours." Every man in the saloon suddenly found reasons to look elsewhere, to study their drinks with intense concentration. Childbirth was women's business, dangerous business, and none of them wanted any part of it, especially not in a blizzard with a difficult delivery. Hannah felt her heart begin to race. She had studied Sarah Mitchell's sections on childbirth, had read the detailed descriptions of what could go wrong and how to address it. But reading about something and actually doing it were vastly different things. She had never delivered a baby, had never even witnessed a birth, but Porter's wife was dying, and there was no one else. "I'll come," Hannah said, her voice cutting through the silence. Every head in the saloon turned to stare at her. Porter looked at her with desperate hope mixed with doubt. "You're not a midwife," he said. "No," Hannah agreed, "but I've studied obstetrics. I know more than anyone else here, and your wife needs help now." Porter didn't hesitate further, desperation overriding skepticism. "Get your things," he said. Hannah ran to her room, grabbed her bag with all her herbs and tools. wrapped herself in every warm thing she owned, and added Sarah Mitchell's book because she might need to reference it. When she came back down, Porter had already saddled 2 horses. The storm was still raging, and the journey that normally took an hour would be treacherous and slow. They rode into the blizzard, the wind screaming around them like something alive and malicious. Hannah could barely see Porter's back, even though he was only a few feet ahead. The cold bit through her layers of clothing, with teeth that felt personal, and more than once she wondered if they would even make it to the ranch, or if they would simply freeze in the saddle and be found as ice sculptures when the storm finally passed. But they pressed on, and after what felt like hours but was probably closer to 90 minutes, they reached Porter's ranch, a collection of buildings barely visible through the driving snow. Porter led her directly to the house, where the sounds of screaming cut through even the howl of the wind. Inside, the scene was chaos. Porter's wife, Rebecca, lay on a bed in the main room, her face grey with pain and exhaustion. Blood soaked the sheets beneath her, and 3 small children huddled in the corner. Terrified and crying, an older woman, Rebecca's mother, stood beside the bed, wringing her hands uselessly. "She's been laboring since yesterday," the mother said, her voice breaking. "The baby won't come. Something's wrong. She's going to die." Hannah pushed down the panic rising in her throat and forced herself to think clinically, to remember everything she had read. She washed her hands thoroughly in the hot water someone had prepared, then examined Rebecca as gently as she could. What she found confirmed her worst fears. The baby was breech positioned wrong, and Rebecca had been pushing so long that she was completely exhausted. "The baby's backwards," Hannah said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I need to try to turn it. It's going to hurt, but it's the only chance." Rebecca grabbed her hand with surprising strength. "Do whatever you have to," she gasped. "Just save my baby." Hannah pulled out Sarah Mitchell's book and found the section on breech births. She read it quickly, committing the instructions to memory, then prepared a strong tea of herbs that would help manage pain and reduce bleeding. She had Rebecca drink it, then waited a few minutes for it to take effect. What followed was the longest and most terrifying hour of Hannah's life. She worked with careful desperation, following the book's instructions to manually manipulate the baby's position. Rebecca screamed until her voice gave out, then screamed silently, her body arching with pain that Hannah could only imagine. Twice Hannah thought she had lost them both. Twice she felt the flutter of panic that threatened to paralyze her. But Nakato's lessons about staying calm under pressure, about trusting her knowledge and her hands, kept her focused, and finally, after an eternity of blood and pain and fear, she felt the baby shift, felt the tiny body move into the correct position. "Now," she told Rebecca, "now you can push." Rebecca pushed with the last reserves of strength her body possessed, and the baby came, a tiny girl, blue and silent and terrifying in her stillness. Hannah cleared the infant's mouth and nose, rubbed her back vigorously, and for a horrible moment, nothing happened. Then the baby coughed, sputtered, and began to cry, a thin, angry sound that was the most beautiful thing Hannah had ever heard. She wrapped the infant in clean cloth and handed her to Rebecca, who clutched the baby to her chest and wept with relief and exhaustion. Hannah turned her attention to the afterbirth and the bleeding, using yarrow and shepherd's purse to help the bleeding stop, checking to make sure everything that needed to come out had come out. By the time she was satisfied that both mother and baby would survive, she was shaking with exhaustion and covered in blood. Porter, who had been pacing outside the entire time, came in when he heard the baby crying. He looked at his wife and new daughter, then at Hannah, and his eyes filled with tears. "You saved them," he said simply. "I don't have words." "Rest is what they need now," Hannah said. "And warmth. Keep the room warm and make sure Rebecca drinks plenty of water. I'll leave herbs for pain and to prevent infection. Send for me if anything seems wrong." She stumbled outside. The storm had lessened somewhat, but was still fierce, and she knew there was no way she could ride back to town tonight. Porter insisted she stay in their barn. which was warmer than it sounded because the animal's body heat kept it relatively comfortable. Hannah collapsed onto a pile of hay, too exhausted to even remove her blood-stained clothes. She had done it, had saved 2 lives that would certainly have been lost without her intervention. But the reality of what could have gone wrong, of how close it had been, crashed over her like a wave. She was still shaking when she heard the barn door open. She looked up to see Nakato standing there, snow dusting his shoulders, his face grave. "I heard you were here," he said, "that you delivered a breech baby." "How did you know?" Hannah asked, her voice hoarse. "Word travels fast, even in a blizzard," Nakato said, sitting down beside her in the hay. "And I have been watching Porter's ranch. There has been trouble between him and some of my people. I wanted to make sure the storm did not provide cover for violence." Hannah leaned against him without thinking, too tired to maintain the careful distance they usually kept. "I was so scared," she admitted. "I thought they were both going to die." "But they didn't," Nakato said gently. "Because you had the knowledge and the courage to act. Sarah Mitchell would be proud. My sister would be proud. I am proud." Hannah felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "What if I had failed?" she whispered. "What if my inexperience had killed them? What if the sun refused to rise because it might fail to warm the earth?" Nakato replied. "You cannot live in fear of failure. You can only do your best with what you know, and your best saved 2 lives tonight." They sat in silence for a while, sharing warmth in the cold barn. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the world, but inside there was peace of a kind, the peace that comes after a battle successfully fought, even if the war itself continues. "There's going to be trouble," Nakato said eventually, his voice heavy. "Blackwood has been spreading rumors, saying that you're corrupting white women with Indian ways, saying that your remedies are dangerous. He's found allies among people who fear change." "I know," Hannah said. "I've heard the whispers, but what can I do? Stop helping people?" "No," Nakato said firmly, "but you must be careful. Document everything you do, every treatment, every success, when they come for you, and they will come for you. You must have evidence that your methods work." "When they come for me," Hannah repeated, fear creeping back into her voice. Nakato turned to face her, his dark eyes serious in the dim light filtering through the barn's cracks. "Blackwood is planning something," he said. "I don't know what yet, but I hear things, see things. He cannot tolerate your success because it undermines his power. Every person you help is someone who might question his authority." "So what do I do?" Hannah asked. "You continue." Nakato said, "You help people. You document your work and you prepare. I will teach you more. Things I have not taught you yet. Things about politics and power, about how to build alliances that will protect you when words alone cannot." Hannah nodded, understanding that her education was far from complete. "Will you stay?" she asked. "Just for tonight. I don't want to be alone." Nakato hesitated, then nodded. "I will stay," he said. "But we must be careful. If Porter or his family sees us together like this, there will be talk." "I don't care anymore," Hannah said with sudden vehemence. "Let them talk. You're my friend, maybe my only real friend, and I won't hide that to make bigots comfortable." Nakato smiled, a rare expression that transformed his usually serious face. "You have changed much since that day in the saloon," he said. "The woman who was spat on would not have spoken so boldly." "The woman who was spat on didn't know she had value," Hannah replied. "You showed me I did, you and Sarah Mitchell, and all the people I've helped. I can't unknow that now." They talked through the night, about medicine and politics, about the past and the uncertain future, about the delicate balance between helping people and protecting yourself. Nakato told her about the Modoc Wars, about battles lost and won, about the cost of resistance and the cost of surrender. "My people fought because we had no choice," he said. "We lost because we were outnumbered and outgunned, but we fought with honor, and that matters. How you fight matters as much as whether you win." "I'm not sure I'm brave enough to fight," Hannah admitted. "You've already been fighting," Nakato said. "Every time you help someone despite the risks, every time you stand up to men like Blackwood, you are fighting and you are winning. Slowly, quietly, but winning nonetheless." When dawn broke grey and cold, the storm had finally passed. Hannah checked on Rebecca and the baby one more time, satisfied that both were stable, then prepared to ride back to town. Porter pressed money into her hand. "Far more than she would have asked for. This doesn't begin to repay you," he said, "but it's what I can offer." Hannah accepted it, knowing that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. With this money, she could buy more supplies, could help more people, could build something that might last beyond her. Nakato rode with her back to Silver Ridge, not hiding now, but openly accompanying her. People they passed on the road stared, and Hannah knew that by afternoon, the whole town would know that the Saloon girl and the Modoc had spent the night together. The gossip would be vicious and probably obscene. "Are you sure about this?" Nakato asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Once people see us together openly, they will make assumptions." "Let them assume," Hannah said. "I'm tired of living according to other people's rules. Tired of making myself small to avoid their discomfort. If they want to think the worst of me, they'll find reasons, regardless of what I do." When they reached the edge of town, Nakato stopped his horse. "I must leave for a while," he said. "There are problems with my people that I cannot ignore, but I will return, and if you need me before then, leave a message with Mrs. Carmichael. I have ways of getting information." "How long will you be gone?" Hannah asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of her voice. "A week, maybe 2, Nakato said. "Be careful while I'm gone, stay visible, make sure you're always around people. Blackwood is less likely to act if there are witnesses." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small knife in a beaded sheath. "Take this," he said. "I hope you never need to use it, but better to have it than wish you did." Hannah took the knife, feeling the weight of it, the seriousness of the gift. "I'll be careful," she promised. Nakato nodded, then did something unexpected. He leaned forward and touched his forehead briefly to hers, a gesture of intimacy and respect. "You are stronger than you know," he said softly. "Remember that." Then he was gone, riding away toward the distant mountains, and Hannah was left alone to face whatever was coming. But she wasn't the same woman who had been humiliated in the Copper Star Saloon 2 months ago. She was harder now, stronger, more certain of her worth. She rode into town with her head high, aware of the stares, the whispers, the judgment, but none of it touched her the way it once would have. She had saved 2 lives last night, had done something that mattered, and no amount of gossip could take that away. When she reached the Copper Star, Vernon Haskell was waiting, his expression unreadable. "I heard what you did at Porter's Ranch," he said. "Impressive work." "Thank you," Hannah said, surprised by the compliment. "But we need to talk," Haskell continued, his tone hardening. "Blackwood was here this morning. He's organizing some kind of meeting. Says he wants to address concerns about your medical practice." Hannah felt her stomach drop. "What kind of concerns?" she asked. "The kind that end badly for people," Haskell said bluntly. "I suggest you start thinking about how to defend yourself, because he's coming for you, and he's bringing the full weight of his money and influence." Hannah nodded slowly, understanding that the battle Nakato had warned her about was beginning. But she also knew she wasn't facing it alone. She had allies now, people who had been helped by her remedies, women who would remember her kindness. "When is this meeting?" she asked. "Tomorrow night," Haskell said. "At the town hall, and Hannah, wear something respectable. Appearance matters in these things." She spent the rest of that day preparing, not just gathering her supplies and documentation, but mentally preparing herself for what was essentially a trial. She would have to defend her methods, her knowledge, her very right to help people, against a man who commanded respect through fear and money. That night, alone in her small room, Hannah opened Sarah Mitchell's book one more time. On the inside cover, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Faint pencil marks that formed words when you looked at them from the right angle. To those who carry this knowledge forward, remember that healing is an act of rebellion against a world that profits from suffering. Be brave, Hannah traced the words with her finger, feeling a connection across time to a woman she had never met, but who had changed her life. Tomorrow she would face Blackwood and his allies, would defend not just herself, but the principle that knowledge should be shared, that healing shouldn't be hoarded by those with power. She wasn't sure she would win, but she knew she had to fight. And for the first time in her life she felt ready. The town hall was packed by the time Hannah arrived, every bench filled, people standing along the walls, faces she recognized from the saloon, from the general store, from the street, all gathered to witness what Cornelius Blackwood had positioned as a reckoning. The air was thick with tension, and the smell of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. And Hannah could feel the weight of their collective judgment even before anyone spoke. She wore her best dress, the dark blue one she saved for occasions that required respectability. Her hair was pinned up neatly, and she carried a leather satchel containing Sarah Mitchell's book, her detailed notes on every treatment she had performed, and testimonials she had collected from patients willing to speak on her behalf. Mrs. Carmichael had helped her prepare, drilling her on how to speak clearly and confidently, how to meet hostility with facts rather than emotion. Blackwood stood at the front of the room beside Mayor Thornton, looking supremely confident in his expensive suit, his silver watch chain gleaming in the lamplight. Dutch Carroll sat in the front row with several other ranchers, all wearing expressions of grim satisfaction, as if they had already decided the outcome and were simply waiting for the formality to play out. Mayor Thornton called the meeting to order, his face carefully neutral. "We're here tonight to address concerns raised by Mr. Blackwood regarding medical practices being conducted by Miss Hannah Price," he announced, his voice carrying to the back of the crowded room. "Mr. Blackwood, you called this meeting, so you may begin." Blackwood stood, taking his time, making sure every eye was on him before he spoke. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his tone reasonable and concerned, "I bring this matter before you not out of personal animosity, but out of genuine worry for the safety and well-being of this community." He paused, letting the words settle. "Miss Price has been practicing medicine without training, without certification, without any of the qualifications that we require of Dr. Webb. She has been administering remedies derived from Indian superstitions, treatments that have no basis in modern medical science." Hannah felt her jaw tighten, but forced herself to remain still. To let him finish before she responded, Blackwood was building his case carefully, making himself sound like the voice of reason and caution. "Now, I understand that some of you have been satisfied with her treatments," Blackwood continued. "But satisfaction is not the same as safety. Just because someone hasn't died yet doesn't mean they won't. And when tragedy strikes, when someone is permanently harmed or killed by these unproven remedies, the blood will be on all our hands for allowing this to continue." He pulled out a stack of papers, waving them for emphasis. "I have here affidavits from medical professionals in the territorial capital, doctors with real training, who state unequivocally that the kind of folk medicine Miss Price practices is dangerous and should be prohibited by law." A murmur ran through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncertain. Hannah scanned the faces, trying to gauge how many were already against her, how many might still be persuaded. "Furthermore," Blackwood said, his voice rising slightly, "there is the matter of Miss Price's associations. She has been seen repeatedly in the company of a Modoc Indian, spending nights alone with him, learning these questionable practices from him. Now, I'm not saying there's anything immoral happening, but I am saying that a woman who keeps such company cannot be trusted to understand what's appropriate for decent Christian folks." The murmur grew louder, more hostile. Hannah felt heat rising in her face, not from shame, but from anger at how skillfully Blackwood was manipulating the crowd's prejudices, turning her friendship with Nakato into something sordid and suspicious. Mayor Thornton raised his hand for silence. "Miss Price, you'll have a chance to respond," he said, then looked at Blackwood. Is there anything else? Just one more thing, Blackwood said, his tone becoming grave. I've spoken with the territorial governor's office. They've informed me that practicing medicine without proper credentials is a criminal offense, punishable by fine and imprisonment. I would hate to see Miss Price face such consequences, which is why I'm proposing a simple solution. She stops these activities immediately, returns to her proper work at the Copper Star, and we all move forward without further legal action. He sat down, looking satisfied, and the room erupted in competing voices, some calling for Hannah to be arrested, others defending her. The chaos lasted several minutes before Thornton managed to restore order. Miss Price, the mayor said, you may speak. Hannah stood, her legs steadier than she expected. She walked to the front of the room, set her satchel on the table, and turned to face the crowd for a moment. She was transported back to that day in the Copper Star when she had been humiliated and helpless. But she was not that woman anymore. Mr. Blackwood speaks of safety and qualifications, she began, her voice clear and carrying, so let me present some facts. In the 3 months since I began treating people, I have helped 47 individuals. I have documentation of every case, every remedy used, and every outcome. She pulled out her notebook, holding it up. Mrs. Carmichael's chronic cough, gone. The seamstress's arthritis, significantly improved. Thomas Brennan, alive when he would have bled to death waiting for Dr. Webb. Rebecca Porter and her baby, both alive when they would certainly have died without intervention. She set the notebook down and pulled out a stack of letters. I have here testimonials from 23 people willing to state publicly that my treatments helped them. Some of these people are in this room tonight. Are you going to tell them they're wrong about their own experiences? A woman in the back stood up. Hannah recognized her as Martha Green, the blacksmith's wife. My daughter suffered every month with pains so severe she couldn't work, Martha said loudly. Dr. Webb told me it was natural and nothing could be done. Miss Price gave her a tea that changed her life. And I won't sit here and listen to anyone say she did wrong. Another voice joined in, then another, people Hannah had helped standing to defend her. Not everyone, but enough to create a counter-narrative to Blackwood's accusations. The room divided visibly, half nodding in agreement, half scowling with disapproval. Blackwood stood up, his face reddening. Testimonials from ignorant women don't change the fact that she has no formal training, he shouted over the noise. She's practicing medicine based on a book written by an Indian lover who died decades ago. Sarah Mitchell was a trained nurse, Hannah shot back, her voice rising to match his. She studied at one of the best medical schools in the East before coming west. Her book documents treatments that have been used successfully for thousands of years, and treatments that work regardless of whether you approve of their origin. She pulled out the book, holding it up so everyone could see. This book contains more practical medical knowledge than most doctors ever learn. It documents how to treat infections, deliver babies, set broken bones, manage fevers, and dozens of other conditions using plants that grow right here in this territory, plants that cost nothing and are available to everyone. And that's exactly the problem, Blackwood snarled, losing his composure. You're teaching people they don't need to pay for real medicine. You're undermining the entire system. The words hung in the air, and Hannah saw several faces in the crowd shift as they understood what Blackwood had accidentally revealed. This wasn't really about safety or qualifications, it was about money and control. So that's what this is really about, Hannah said quietly, but her voice carried. You're not worried I'll hurt people. You're worried I'll help them without enriching you or the doctors you have connections with. You're worried that if people learn they can heal themselves, they won't be dependent on men like you. Mayor Thornton leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Mr. Blackwood, is that accurate? He asked. Of course not, Blackwood blustered. I'm concerned about proper standards. Then why did you mention cost? Thornton pressed. Why does it matter if Miss Price's remedies are inexpensive? Blackwood opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing he had walked into a trap. The crowd's mood was shifting, not entirely in Hannah's favor, but enough to create doubt about Blackwood's motives. Hannah seized the moment. "I don't claim to be a doctor," she said, addressing the crowd directly. "I've never pretended to have formal training, but I have knowledge that helps people, and I share it freely with anyone who wants to learn. That's what scares men like Mr. Blackwood, not that I might fail, but that I might succeed." Dr. Webb, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood up, and the room fell silent. Everyone knew his opinion would carry weight. "I've examined Miss Price's work," he said, his voice measured. "I've reviewed her notes, spoken with her patients, and observed her treatments, while I initially had reservations. I cannot in good conscience say she's doing harm." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "In fact, in several cases, her remedies have been more effective than conventional treatments. The yarrow she used on Thomas Brennan probably saved his life. The breech delivery she performed on Rebecca Porter was textbook perfect. She has skills and knowledge that are valuable, and refusing to acknowledge that because of prejudice about where she learned it would be foolish." Blackwood looked like he had been slapped. "You're defending her," he said incredulously. "You, a real doctor, defending some saloon girl playing at medicine." "I'm defending competence wherever I find it," Webb replied coolly. "And I'm opposing ignorance masquerading as concern. Miss Price has saved lives, Mr. Blackwood. What have you done lately besides line your pockets?" The room erupted again, but this time the energy was different. People were arguing with each other rather than simply condemning Hannah the neat. Narrative Blackwood had tried to construct was falling apart. Then the door at the back of the hall opened and Nakato walked in, his presence immediately commanding attention. He had told Hannah he would be gone for a week or two, but here he was, and the room went completely silent. He walked down the center aisle with deliberate slowness, his eyes fixed on Blackwood. When he reached the front, he turned to address the crowd. "I am Nakato," he said, his English formal and precise. "I am Modoc, and I am the person who gave Hannah Price the book she has been learning from." Blackwood smiled, thinking this would support his case. "So you admit to teaching her Indian superstitions," he said triumphantly. "I admit to sharing knowledge that my people have preserved for generations," Nakato replied. "Knowledge that has kept us alive in this land far longer than your people have been here. You call it superstition because you do not understand it. But your ignorance does not make you right." He turned to the crowd. "I have fought in wars," he said. "I have seen men die from wounds that could have been healed if anyone had bothered to learn from those who knew. I have watched my people suffer because white doctors refused to treat them, or treated them badly, or charged prices we could never pay." His voice grew stronger, more passionate. "Hannah Price learned from our knowledge because she was willing to see value in it, because she understood that healing belongs to no one people, that suffering does not care about your prejudices. She has used what I taught her to help people of all kinds, and if you punish her for that, you are fools." Mayor Thornton held up his hand. "Mr. Nakato, while I appreciate your perspective, the question before us is one of legal authority." "Then let me address that," came a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see a well-dressed man in his 50s entering, carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as James Morrison, a territorial attorney from the capital. "I was in Silver Ridge on other business," Morrison said, "and heard about this meeting. I feel obligated to clarify some legal matters. First, Mr. Blackwood's claim that practicing medicine without credentials is automatically criminal is incorrect. The territorial statute in question applies specifically to those who claim to be licensed physicians when they are not." He pulled out a law book, flipping to a marked page. "Miss Price has never claimed to be a doctor. She has provided herbal remedies and basic medical assistance. which falls under common law rights that have existed for centuries. Midwives, herbalists, and folk healers have always operated in this legal space, and no statute prohibits their practice. Blackwood's face went white. "That can't be right." He said, "It is right," Morrison replied firmly. "And furthermore, attempting to prevent someone from providing such assistance could actually be construed as reckless endangerment, particularly in a territory where medical professionals are scarce. If Miss Price's treatments are effective and safe, as Dr. Webb has testified, then preventing her from helping people could be considered criminal." The lawyer looked directly at Blackwood. "So if you're considering legal action, Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you reconsider, because you're more likely to find yourself defending a lawsuit than winning one." The air went out of Blackwood's argument like a punctured balloon. He looked around the room, searching for support, but found mostly neutral or hostile faces. Even his closest allies seemed to be reconsidering their positions. Hannah felt something loosening in her chest, something that had been tight for months. She wasn't winning exactly, but she wasn't losing either, and in a fight she had expected to lose completely. That felt like victory. Mayor Thornton cleared his throat. "Given the legal clarification and Dr. Webb's professional opinion, I see no grounds for prohibiting Miss Price from continuing her work," he announced. "However, I would recommend that she maintain detailed records and work in cooperation with Dr. Webb when possible, to ensure the highest standard of care." "That seems reasonable," Webb said, nodding. "I accept those terms," Hannah agreed. Blackwood stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. "This is absurd," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "You're all making a terrible mistake." "The only mistake being made here is yours," Nakato said quietly, but with steel in his voice. "You have tried to destroy a woman who helps people, tried to use fear and prejudice as weapons, but you have failed. And everyone in this room now knows what kind of man you are." Blackwood stared at him with hatred so pure it was almost physical. "This isn't over," he said, then stormed out of the hall, Dutch Carroll and a few others following him. The tension that had been holding the room rigid suddenly released. People began talking among themselves, some coming forward to congratulate Hannah, others leaving quickly, as if embarrassed to have been there at all. Mrs. Carmichael pushed through the crowd and embraced Hannah. "You did it," she said, tears in her eyes. "You stood up to him." "We did it," Hannah corrected. "I couldn't have done this without everyone who spoke up." Martha Green and several other women gathered around, offering their support and gratitude, and Hannah realized that what had started as a trial had become something else, a moment where the community had been forced to choose, and enough of them had chosen right. Nakato stood apart, watching with satisfaction. When the crowd finally thinned, Hannah made her way to him. "You came back early," she said. "I heard what Blackwood was planning." Nakato replied, "I could not let you face it alone." "Thank you," Hannah said, and the words felt inadequate for what she wanted to express. For the gratitude and something deeper, something she was only beginning to understand. Dr. Webb approached them, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Price, I meant what I said in there. Your work is valuable. I'd like to propose an arrangement. You continue treating patients with herbal remedies and basic care, and refer serious cases to me in exchange. I'll teach you some conventional techniques and consult with you on difficult cases." Hannah's eyes widened. "You're serious," she said. "Entirely," Webb replied. "I'm getting old, and this territory needs more people who know how to heal. Your methods are different from mine, but they work, and I'd be a fool to ignore that out of pride." "I accept," Hannah said immediately, "and thank you." After Webb left, Hannah and Nakato walked out into the cold night. The stars were brilliant overhead, and their breath made clouds in the freezing air. They walked in silence for a while, processing everything that had happened. "Blackwood will try again," Nakato said eventually. "He's not a man who forgives humiliation." "I know," Hannah replied, "but tonight, for the first time, I'm not afraid of him. I have allies now, people who will stand with me." "You have more than that," Nakato said. stopping and turning to face her. "You have earned respect, the kind that cannot be taken away by gossip or threats." Hannah looked up at him, at this man who had changed her life by refusing to walk past her suffering, who had taught her to see her own worth. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she said softly. "You would have found another way," Nakato replied. "The strength was always in you. I only helped you see it." They stood close together in the cold, and Hannah felt something shifting between them, something that had been building since that first day in the saloon, but had remained unspoken. "Unnamed Nakato," she began, unsure how to put feelings into words. He reached out and gently touched her face, his calloused hand warm against her cold cheek. "I know," he said quietly. "I feel it too." "Is it allowed?" Hannah asked. "Between us, nothing about us has ever been allowed," Nakato replied with a slight smile. "We have already broken every rule that people like Blackwood believe in." "What is one more?" Hannah laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. "Then I suppose we might as well be thorough about it," she said. Nakato pulled her close, and they stood together under the stars, two people who had found each other across divides that were supposed to be uncrossable, who had built something real from shared suffering and mutual respect. "What happens now?" Hannah asked after a while. "Now we continue," Nakato said. "We help people, we face whatever challenges come, and we do it together." "Together," Hannah repeated, and the word felt like a promise, like a foundation strong enough to build a future on. They walked back toward town hand in hand, knowing that tomorrow would bring new struggles, new opposition, but tonight they had won something important. Not just a battle in the town hall, but the right to define themselves on their own terms, to love and work and exist without asking permission from those who would deny them. The lights of Silver Ridge glowed ahead, a town that was changing slowly, reluctantly, but changing nonetheless, and Hannah knew that she had played a part in that change, that her refusal to accept humiliation, her willingness to learn and grow, had created ripples that would spread far beyond one saloon. One confrontation, one person, she had been spat on and mocked, had been told she was worthless, but she had proven them wrong, not through violence or revenge, but through the simple radical act of becoming more than they said she could be. And that, she understood now, was the most powerful rebellion of all. Spring arrived in Silver Ridge with wildflowers erupting across the desert, painting the landscape with hope after months of grey cold. 6 months had passed since the town hall confrontation, and the town had settled into a new normal that would have been unimaginable before. Hannah no longer worked at the Copper Star instead. She had opened a small clinic on Main Street with Dr. Webb's help. The sign outside read, "Hannah Price, Herbalist and Midwife," and it was hers. Built on knowledge earned and respect won through undeniable results, Dr. Webb had kept his promise, teaching her conventional medical techniques while learning from her herbal expertise. Together they had created something unique, a practice blending traditional medicine with indigenous knowledge, serving anyone regardless of ability to pay. Patients came from distant places seeking treatment they couldn't find elsewhere. Nakato had become a regular presence in town, no longer hiding in shadows. He had negotiated peace between the Modoc families and white settlers, using Hannah's influence to build bridges that seemed impossible. Slowly, grudgingly, attitudes began to shift. Cornelius Blackwood had fled to California in February after investigations uncovered his financial crimes. Dutch Carroll went with him. Their departure lifted a shadow from Silver Ridge, and in that space, something better was growing. On a bright April morning, Mrs. Carmichael burst into Hannah's clinic. Breathless with excitement, "You need to come outside," she said. "There's someone you should meet." In the street stood a well-dressed woman in her 30s. "Speaking with Dr. Webb, Miss Price," Webb called. "This is Dr. Catherine Winters from the Territorial Medical College." Dr. Winters smiled warmly. "Miss Price, I've heard remarkable things about your work. I've been documenting innovative medical practices across the territory, and your clinic came highly recommended." She pulled out a leather folder, I'm here to offer you admission to the Territorial Medical College. Full scholarship, with the understanding that after you complete the program, you'll return here to continue your work." Hannah's heart skipped. "Medical college," she repeated, hardly daring to believe it. "But I have no formal education. You have experience, documented success, and a mind proven capable of learning," Dr. Winters said. "Dr. Webb, Mayor Thornton, Mrs. Carmichael, and 40 of your patients wrote recommendations. You've earned this." Hannah looked around at the watching faces, people she had helped, who had defended her. "Say yes," Mrs. Carmichael urged through tears. Hannah saw Nakato at the crowd's edge. Watching with pride, he nodded once firmly. "Yes," Hannah said, her voice strengthening. "Yes, I'll do it." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Hannah felt overwhelmed by the reversal of everything she had once believed about herself. She had been a saloon girl that men spat on, and now she was becoming a doctor. That evening, Hannah and Nakato walked to their favorite ridge overlooking town, the sun setting in gold and purple. "You're leaving," Nakato said, not a question. "Only for 2 years," Hannah replied. "Then I'll come back." "Much can change in 2 years," Nakato said quietly. Hannah took his hand. "Not everything." "Not this," Nakato smiled. "I will wait. I've waited for many things. I can wait for you, or you could come with me," Hannah said impulsively. Nakato shook his head gently. "My place is here, continuing the work we started. But I will write to you, and when you return, I will be here." Hannah leaned against him. "I never thought my life could be like this," she said softly. "You were always more," Nakato replied. "You just needed someone to see it. And then you needed to see it yourself." They sat as darkness fell and stars emerged. Two people who had found each other in the least likely way, who had proven that barriers between peoples were not as solid as everyone claimed. "Thank you," Hannah said, "for everything. For seeing me when no one else did." "Thank you for being worth standing with," Nakato replied. "My sister would have loved you." Hannah pulled out Sarah Mitchell's book. Worn from constant use, she had added her own inscription. "To those who come after, knowledge is a bridge. Courage is the willingness to cross it." "She would approve," Nakato said. The lights of Silver Ridge twinkled below, a town that had changed because people like Hannah refused to accept things as they were. Because Nakato chose to help rather than walk away. "I'll come back in 2 years with everything I've learned," Hannah promised. "I know you will," Nakato said, "and I will be here." They sat together under the wheeling stars. Two people who had defied expectations, who had proven that dignity could not be stolen by cruelty, that knowledge could transform lives, that love could cross any divide. Hannah had been spat on in a saloon 6 months ago, humiliated and broken, but she had stood up, learned, fought and won, not just against Blackwood, but against the belief that she was powerless. She had chosen differently, and that choice had changed everything. As they walked back hand in hand, Hannah thought about the women who would come after her, who would know that transformation was possible, that circumstances did not define futures, that knowledge and courage could overcome almost anything. The story that began with humiliation ended with hope, with a woman who had claimed her power, with a man who had helped her find it, with a community that had learned to change, and with a future bright with possibilities. In the morning, Hannah would begin preparing for medical college, but tonight she simply walked with Nakato beneath the stars, grateful for the journey, ready for whatever came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.